but deeply devoted to God. Boaz, an older, virtuous gentleman who defines what it means to be gallant and noble. And then throw in a cunning mother-in-law who spices things up. Throughout the story, you really want Ruth and Boaz to get together. And when we last left them, Ruth had made her willingness known to Boaz that she was keen, because he was a kinsman or family redeemer. And you'll see throughout the book, if you read it, this term, kinsman redeemer. And in the Jewish culture of the day, if a father or husband died, the closest relative on the father's or husband's side of the family could step in and be what was known as a kinsman redeemer or family redeemer. They had first legal rights to marry if that was deemed best, particularly if the widow was childless, to provide a male heir for the family. And Boaz was one of Ruth's kinsman redeemers. But we learned last week, in a twist to the story, that he wasn't the closest male relative to her dead husband. There was another one who was closer. So that relative had the right to marry her, to fulfill the duty of becoming her family redeemer before Boaz did. However, if he wasn't interested or he wasn't financially able to redeem her, Boaz could. So we left the story with Boaz making a commitment to Ruth. He would find this other kinsman redeemer and sort out the issue of marriage. And if he could not redeem her, then Boaz would step in and marry her. God is moving in Ruth's life, but nevertheless, I would imagine it was a stressful time. Let's do some reading. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line, and I will redeem it." I love how Laura Smith and Stephen Fowle comment. What Ruth initiated in the darkness at the threshing floor reached its conclusion in the daylight before the witnesses at the town's gates. So Boaz sets out to resolve the issues raised by the fact that he is not the closest relative to Naomi and Ruth. We never really find out who this relative is. Clearly, Boaz wants this to be the decisive event at the gate, and he wants to settle the matter. An interesting point. Although Boaz must have known who this unnamed Redeemer person was, he never refers to him by name. And so when you do the Hebrew translation, this is the best English translation for this guy's name. So-and-so. So-and-so. Now, Boaz encounters this so-and-so at the gate of the town where he can carry out legal and commercial transactions, including issues around marriage in the presence of witnesses. And Leviticus tends to hint that this so-and-so should have already extended aid to Naomi and Ruth, along the lines that Boaz had clearly been willing to do. It could be why he is not mentioned by name. If any of your fellow Israelites, reading from Leviticus, become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. However, to this guy's credit, or woman, he does not hesitate to accept his obligations. And as Naomi is old and will not have any further children, there's no one to redeem this land. So this is a really safe and secure opportunity for him, right? So Boaz seems to know what he needs to do to clear this up before they even get to Ruth, because that's the real sticking point. It could really upset Boaz's plans to marry her. Naomi wants to sell the land, and it would be good and just thing for her family redeemer to be the one to buy it so that it stays within the family. If Ruth or Naomi were to ever produce a male heir, in other words, they would buy it and keep it in trust to be passed on, if Naomi or Ruth did that, they'd hold on to it until one of them produced a male heir. Contrary to our expectations, Ruth is not the immediate subject of discussion here. Ruth 4, 2-3. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." In verse 2, Boaz gathers 10 elders from the city. He wants to constitute a legal forum. That's how they did their legal stuff in those days, so that proceedings can start. And once everyone's in place, he wastes no time raising the reason he's there. He gets straight to the point. He also puts pressure on the unnamed redeemer to make a decision quickly. So he agrees to buy the land. However, Boaz is a crafty negotiator. Let's read on. And then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Amazing, eh? You take off your sandal. Wow. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Boaz seems to know that he needs to clear this up because he wants to get to the sticking point of marrying Ruth. And here's what a person with no integrity would want to do to buy the land and not marry Ruth, and just wait for them to die, so it would all become part of his. He would walk away free and clear, making a great investment. Then the man backs out just as quickly as he says yes, he says no. Because he knew that if he married Ruth and she had a child, the property he redeemed would go to that child. He'd be out the money he paid to redeem the land and then out of the land. He had no interest in caring for Ruth, only in what he might gain. Now, this was all taking place in Bethlehem, a small town, which means he knew about Naomi and Ruth, and he knew he was the closest family redeemer all along. Yet he never said a word, or he never did anything. Amazing. Didn't even try to care for her, even in the smallest way. You can feel how the writer of Ruth, the person telling the story, feels about him. They never name him. So very quickly, the unnamed redeemer realizes that he's just not up for it. He's not up to fulfilling the social and the moral responsibilities associated with buying land. Then he expresses the transfer symbolically by the physical act that customarily accompanied such a transfer. He removed his sandal and gave them to Boaz. Finally, it looks like we might get our happy ever after ending. Finish to the story. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Wow, amazing. What a finish and a real twist at the end. I can see why it's often called one of the best short stories ever written. So, Boaz marries Ruth, and she has a son, and Naomi's life has moved from tragedy to happiness. Remember how Naomi felt at the start of the story. It's more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. That's what she thought. But not only did Ruth give birth, but to a son. And the role of a family redeemer in the life of a woman like Ruth was to try and ensure that there would be a male heir. The fact that Ruth would conceive and give birth to the son meant that culturally her redemption was complete. And so was Naomi's in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And if you're a grandparent and you've ever taken a grandchild in your arms, you know exactly how she felt. The description of Naomi holding and loving Obed was the most tender and generous one of her in the entire story. So even that ends on a good note. However, that's not the end of the story. This verse is really important. Then the woman said to Naomi, Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. Amazing. So, who was this child? Well, there's a book of the Bible that tells his story, actually. It's called the Book of Obadiah. However, in verse 17, there's another twist to the story. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The son of Ruth and Boaz was the grandfather of none other than King David. But that's not all. Ruth is actually mentioned in the New Testament as well. She's one of the few people who appear in the pages of the Old Testament, but who is also mentioned in the New Testament. And one of the even fewer who were women. And it's another reference to genealogy, to whakapapa. The New Testament begins with a genealogy of 42 consecutive generations, putting forward a family line that leads to one very specific person. And here's how it starts. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Then going on like that for a few more generations, we get to some people who are very well known to us. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So here, again, is another amazing twist in the story. This wonderful man, Boaz, was the son of none other than Rahab, whose story is told in the book of Joshua. And if you're not familiar with her story, she was a prostitute who ran a brothel, who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho because she came to believe in the God of Israel. Rahab and her family were saved, and they actually became part of the Jewish people. She left behind her life of prostitution and became one of the most celebrated women in Jewish history. She was the mother of Boaz. Then after a few more generational listenings, it gets to the reason for such a detailed record and tells us where the family line of Boaz and Ruth would eventually lead. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah. Ruth, the woman who was redeemed, gave birth to the son who would continue the line that would lead to Jesus, the Redeemer of the whole world. When I was a hospital chaplain, I was talking to a specialist at the hospital. I got to know her a bit. And she was moved over from the UK. And she'd grown up in a very strict Muslim family. And part of her reason for coming to New Zealand was to escape her religion. And we had many chats. And one time she came to me after reading the Gospels at my suggestion. She couldn't believe at how much Jesus valued women. I've never ever felt that in the Muslim faith, she said. And I like the comment from Darrell Bock in his commentary on Ruth. He says this: more than anyone in the history of Israel, Ruth embodies the fundamental ethic of the nation's ethic. You shall love your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. In Leviticus 19:34, Moses instructs the Israelites to love the stranger as they love themselves. Ironically, it is this stranger from Moab who shows the Israelites what this means. And the genealogy has another function in the story. It brings the story full circle from Naomi's absolute emptiness and thinking God had abandoned her to restoration and fullness. However, the point of the story is extended beyond showing God's providence and care in the line of just one family. We see that it concerns the entire nation of Israel. Furthermore, God's rule through King David, right up to God's own Son, Jesus Christ, will come through, it will flow through the story of Ruth and Naomi. And I like how this guy comments. Ruth's decision to commit her life to Naomi and Yahweh bears results that she cannot have possibly imagined. This is especially true in the context of what God will do for her and her descendants. And at the root of the story, I'm going to mention it again. I've harped on about it. I'm going to mention it again. At the root of this story is this word hesed. This rich term enables us to act with loyalty and love and compassion. And when this is combined with integrity, as we see with Boaz, it's a powerful ethic and a powerful story. And we can learn much from Boaz because we live in a world that demands to get its own way and is often more than willing to bypass any ethical issue that stands in their way. We see that around the world at the moment. And no, I won't mention Greenland. If we come across situations that we are unsure about, we need to follow Boaz's lead. He knew the law, the Torah, the Holy Scriptures of the Old Testament. We need to go to the Bible where God's moral standards are laid bare. And of course, we have something that Boaz did not have. We have the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, and we have the infilling of the Holy Spirit to guide us and to guide our community of Ranui Baptist Church. Throughout history, these three have changed the world, and there is no reason why that can't continue to happen. In a fallen world that has lost its way, the Book of Ruth reaffirms the faithfulness of God. It's easy sometimes during stresses of life to forget that the Lord is sovereign and in control and cares for his people. Just as God demonstrated his hesed through Boaz to two widows, he demonstrates his loving faithfulness and loyalty to his people, that's us, today, through individuals living out the spirit of his word, motivated by the commitment to people in need. God's hesed restored Naomi, and it can restore us. But as with Naomi, sometimes the process is slow from our human standpoint. But gradually God brings us back to him. And we need to be reminded that God is always in control. Amen? Amen. Whether it's life or whether it's death. the Lord provides us with our Boaz, sometimes in the form that we would least expect. And as he did in the case of Naomi through Obed. In this process, God demonstrates his ability to answer our prayers and petitions. You know, there's never a situation where God will not listen to our prayers. The Book of Ruth shows in linking Ruth and Naomi's story to the genealogy of David. This little book has not only links with the past, but links with the future. Ruth's story is one that echoes themes of faith, loyalty, love, and of course, her unbelievable commitment to Naomi. And her steadfast love and faith in God highlights the importance of relationships and how they can lead to divine blessings. So this story should also fill us with hope. When we live a life doing hesed to others, loving one another through the community of faith, loving our neighbours, there is the expectation that the impact of our lives will go on far beyond our lifetimes. If you're visiting with us today, we have a trust that works in the community from this church. Does all sorts of amazing work in the community. And one of the drivers of this trust was a guy called Grahame Davis. I never met Grahame as he passed away just a few days before I started here at Ranui. However, in talking to people and hearing about him, his hesed will live long after he's gone. Long after he's gone. The question is, and the question we all face, will our hesed live long after our death? So the book of Ruth in the end really is a kind of love story. We see Naomi's restoration from emptiness to fullness through the selfless acts of a loyal hesed by Ruth and Boaz. In the beginning of the story, Naomi is at odds with God. She believes he's the cause of all her problems, all her hardships. But she learns throughout the story that she was wrong. God was not out to get her. However, her pain is real. Her pain is real. And this is how we should respond. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And at Ranui, we do this to the best of our ability, reminded by our church slogan, which is where people matter. It's also good to be reminded that Ruth was a total outsider, not an Israelite. Yet she ended up in the genealogy that led to Jesus Christ himself. And it's also good to be reminded that we must be the link for the gospel to reach Ranui and to reach the ends of the earth. Ruth's willingness to leave her homeland for a new life in Bethlehem emphasizes her courage to step into the unknown, trusting in God's plan. Also, her actions resulted in her becoming part of the lineage of David, showcasing how God works through individuals, ordinary people like you and me. And just as Ruth embraced faith and loyalty, we too are encouraged to embody these virtues in our lives. So it's been a great series. I've so enjoyed going through Ruth with you. And I just want to finish by saying, may her story inspire you to strengthen your relationships and trust in God's faithfulness no matter what you face. Amen?